It's always a special privilege to interview former Prime Minister John Howard. I caught up with him in this studio a little earlier. Mr Howard, thanks for joining us. Budget deficits as far as the eye can see, Commonwealth debt heading towards $1 trillion, China intimidating Australia in the Tasman Sea, Donald Trump about to impose tariffs, probably including on Australia, war in the Ukraine, war in the Middle East, ugly anti-Semitism at home. Just how dire are the circumstances in which we find ourselves conducting this federal election?
Well, to say the least, it's very challenging. And it's challenging for both sides because there's no simple solution to some of those problems, but some of them have been generated by the Labor side. I mean, the economic scene is much weaker now than it was 3 years ago. But the challenge that the side I'm barracking for, the coalition challenge it has, is to overturn history. We've only seen one-term government turfed out, and that was in 1931. Well, the world was a pretty unhappy place then.
But if we go back to 2010, effectively a first-term government was voted out. It was only because of Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott sort of switching sides, if you like, that Tony Abbott wasn't able to form government. The reason I mention that is, do you think that maybe the electorate is more volatile these days and perhaps a one-term government is a possibility?
I think you're right. The electorate's more volatile, but you can't ignore history. I'd have thought 6 months ago, we'd have had this conversation, I'd have thought the coalition had no hope of winning simply because of history. But the last 6 months, I think Peter Dutton has done a fantastic job. And the description I would make of the Prime Minister is that he's out of his depth. Now, as a Liberal leader, I disagreed with the Labor leaders a lot. I disagreed with Bob Hawke a lot. But I never thought Hawke was out of his depth. I just thought he was wrong. I disagreed even more with Paul Keating, who I thought was inferior to Hawke as a Prime Minister. But you could never say he was out of his depth. Whereas I don't think Anthony Albanese quite knows what's happening around him. I mean, particularly when it comes to Chinese ships, he doesn't seem to have a clue.
Yes, you never doubted the capacity of either Keating or
although I disagreed very strongly with their policy.
Sure, but you mentioned Anthony Albanese being out of his depth. You've said before also he has no gravitas, and then when he speaks, you don't listen.
No.
Just expand on that, and in reference to China and ships and our national security, what worries you about that?
I just don't think he understands the overall context in which these events occur. I don't think he understands that in our part of the world you are seeing emerging an historic contest between the United States-led group of countries and China. And China is making merry hell of some of the surface difficulties between Trump-led America and historic allies.
Is China intimidating Australia? Should we be worried?
We should not be intimidated by China, but we should understand that we have to respond, and that's why AUKUS is so important and why people on any side of politics who criticise AUKUS don't understand the Australian national interest. I mean, to have an ambition, which I think will become a reality, to have nuclear-powered submarines and have it cemented in a partnership with our two oldest and strongest allies, the United States and the United Kingdom, is terrific. That's something we should thank Scott Morrison for because he launched it, and it's very important we build on it.
Given the positive prospects of the AUKUS arrangements and given the threat and intimidation from China, it's the worst possible time, isn't it, for Donald Trump to be doing things that could damage our relationships, especially economically when it comes to tariffs?
Well, I don't agree with tariffs on economic grounds. I made up my mind about the stupidity of tariffs 15, 20 years ago. They do not protect local jobs. All they do is increase local prices. And I think the attitude that President Trump has taken towards some great allies of America's in the past is really blameworthy. I mean, Canada, has he forgotten that when the Allies launched Operation Overlord to liberate Europe from the Nazis, that the third largest of the invading armies was Canadian after the American and the British? Has he forgotten the Canadian contribution in Afghanistan? Now, you can argue the toss about whether getting involved in Afghanistan was right or wrong. I thought it was absolutely right. But you couldn't argue the toss about World War II. That wasn't started by anybody other than Adolf Hitler. Yeah,
your point about Trump's treatment of Canada is spot on, but there's been a political impact of that in Canada. It's helped the Canadian government. And likewise here, Donald Trump looms large over the election campaign, doesn't he? Labor is trying to smear Peter Dutton as some sort of Trumpian figure. Is that realistic? Is it a political threat?
The Labor Party will try any dodge, but it's not realistic. OK, Trump is centre-right, so to speak, although in my view he's not a real conservative. I mean, there are a lot of conservative values that I hold to that he apparently doesn't. I mean, he attacks his own security services. I don't think that makes any sense. On the other hand, things he's said about gender identity and university and so forth, I agree with. Most sensible Australians do, but that's, as it were, the low-hanging fruit. That's the easy part of it. The harder part is what you do to your allies, and to undermine Canada is just, I find it inexplicable.
What does Peter Dutton need to do then in the campaign to make sure there's distance between him and those Trumpian ideas?
Well, I don't think Peter Dutton should become obsessed about Trump, and he's not. I think he understands what the Labor Party is up to. I mean, America's a different country. The Americans are wonderful allies and friends. We shouldn't lose sight of that fact, but their politics is different. Their political system, in my view, is far inferior to the Westminster system. You would never have had a presidential contest between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump a few months ago if you'd have had a Westminster system. In my view, neither of them would have got to the leadership of their own parties in our system.
You've shared your thoughts about Anthony Albanese as a leader. You've said of Peter Dutton that people know where he stands, that you don't think anyone will be accusing him of being something that he's not. How would you describe him as a political leader?
I think strong, purposeful, steady. You want somebody who's steady. He's well-grounded. You can't serve almost a decade in the police force without seeing life often at its worst, but also sometimes pleasingly at its best. And my association with him, and it started when he entered Parliament, when he successfully defeated Cheryl Kernot for the seat of Dixon and held it through successive elections, and along with all those other wonderful Queenslanders, they certainly have known how to vote in the past.
Now, energy is a massive issue in this campaign, a big challenge for the country, prices of electricity and security of supply. You were Prime Minister who did the deal with the Greens to outlaw domestic nuclear energy in this country. Was that a mistake? Do we need to fix it? And realistically, if any modern economy is going to cut their emissions to effectively zero, isn't nuclear energy imperative?
Well, if I can start with what we did some years ago, the reason I did that deal with the Greens and others was to get it through the Senate. And I had to get through a piece of legislation that renewed the nuclear energy facility, which was vital to the treatment of certain forms of cancer at AUKUS sites. And without that legislation, we'd have lost our nuclear medicine capacity. And why on earth the Labor Party thought it was helping the country to say, no, we're not going to support you. So, of course, I thought and refused, much and all as I didn't like it, with the Greens and others. Now, was that a mistake then? I think in the context at the time, no. It was the only way we had of renewing the nuclear medicine facility. Now, of course, it should be lifted. We should, and we have been advocating and very wisely asserting the need for nuclear power as part of the mix.
Modern economies that are trying to reduce their emissions are all looking to nuclear, aren't they? I mean, sure, we could use all the gas.
And some of them are returning to it.
Exactly. So it's inevitable in Australia, isn't it?
Well, it is. And we have 38% of the world's easily recoverable uranium reserves. And the amazing thing is that we are busily dismantling natural advantages that Providence gave us with fossil fuels, uranium, natural gas. Well, Peter Dutton's got a very good plan on natural gas, and coal, of course.
Yeah, some of our largest exports and our most important exports, we have Greens and Labor politicians who don't want us to use them ourselves.
No, that's true. And on top of that, from a humanitarian point of view, we've probably seen more people lifted out of poverty in the last 20 or 30 years since the Industrial Revolution. And that's largely because of the ready availability of electricity in countries such as China and India and parts of Africa. Now, we're walking away from that. That doesn't make any humanitarian sense to me. I thought our mission as a wealthy, successful country was to help the less fortunate, and apparently not.
Now, apart from energy, there are tax offers from both sides. Labor, a 1% cut in the lowest tax rate in just over a year's time. Peter Dutton, immediate relief through a cut, a halving of petrol tax excise. Are either of these affordable or useful?
Well, I take it in isolation. Both are affordable. I think the excise cut is better, not because it's come from the Liberals, it's just immediate, and it affects everybody. We are a car-driving and owning democracy. Think of those outer suburbs of the big cities. People drive all the time. And some drive electric vehicles, but not many. And I just think that it is immediate. As somebody put it, I think it may have been Angus Taylor, he said what the Labor Party is offering is a cut of, 70 cents?
70 cents a day.
70 cents a day in a year's time. That doesn't sound very generous to me.
Well, finally then, Mr Howard, can the Coalition win this election? They would need to take seats off Labor, obviously, but probably off Teals and maybe even the Greens as well. Well,
there are 3 Green seats up for grabs in Queensland, and I think we have a good chance of picking up 1 or 2 of those. I hope a lot. Look, I think it can. It's hard to pick. I mean, I can say, oh, you know, of course we're going to win. History is still against it, but we have got a Prime Minister who's clearly out of his depth, and we have a situation where in less than 3 years the economic situation has deteriorated, and I think there's a real possibility that you may get a bigger movement in the Teals, rather, a bigger movement in the Teal-held seats. People expect. A lot of the predictions are based on the Teals all hanging on. Well, I'm not sure that's going to happen. I think a lot of people who voted for the Teals did so because they were grumpy for one or other reason with the Liberals. I don't think that's the case now. I think they like Dutton. I think they see in Dutton an unexpectedly strong, serious leader. I mean, he's a serious player, and he gives the impression of somebody who's been around, is not full of himself, and does understand the good and the bad in society, and I like that.
Mr Howard, thanks so much for joining us. I know you're going to be out there on the campaign trail, so have a good few weeks ahead.
I will.
Yeah, John Howard there, very realistic about the prospects, says history is a challenge for the Coalition, but the Prime Minister is out of his depth. The economic situation has deteriorated badly over the past 3 years, and the Teals could fall by the wayside. We shall see. Great to talk to him.